In my research, I look back at the history of income and spending for state and local governments in Illinois, and I find a few things. First, I find that Illinois governments have been spending more than their revenue since at least the late 1980s. The second thing I find is that since about the mid-1990s, Illinois governments have been spending much more out of their revenue than the typical U.S. state. So what I find is that the typical U.S. state spends about 106% of its revenue, has been spending that on average since about the mid-1990s, whereas Illinois has been spending 116% of its revenue on average since the mid-1990s. I decided to do this research because I'd been aware for a little while that, Illinois' governments have been accumulating a lot of debt. But I wasn't sure when that started, so I was curious about that and decided to go find out for myself. The data I have go back to the early 1980s. That's as far back as I can go to see when Illinois started overspending. And from what I can tell, it was spending more than Illinois governments were spending more than their revenues at that point. I don't know when so I don't know when exactly it started, but the really big changes started in the mid-1990s, which is when Illinois started being different than a lot of other states. From what I could tell in the 90s, Illinois started spending a lot more on pensions than the typical U.S. state. And overall, I also found that a big contributor to the difference between Illinois governments and the typical U.S. state was spending on pensions. The big problem that results when you spend significantly more than you bring in is that state and local governments can accumulate large amounts of debt. And when there's a large amount of debt, the debt payments get quite large, and that can crowd out spending on other priorities. Many governments in Illinois are now at the point where they can no longer ignore the level of debt they're carrying, and they have to start focusing a lot of their budget on paying off debt. So what that means is policymakers are going to have to make some really difficult decisions about whether to cut spending, raise revenues, or do some kind of combination of both in order to pay off these debts. It's important to remember that they're spending for compensation for employees. So when Illinois governments are spending for pensions, they're really spending for other priorities in a sense. They're spending for, when it's spending for pensions for teachers, it's spending on teachers. When it's spending on pensions for other municipal workers, it's spending on compensation for those municipal workers. So in a sense, it's still spending on these other things that we would consider, that many people would consider to be high priorities, but it's a more indirect way of spending, which perhaps makes it easier to hide or to mismeasure.